December 19th, 1944. Somewhere near the Luxembourg border, the world is a palette of gray and steel. The cold bites through heavy coats. Frost paints the barrels of idling Sherman tanks, lined along a narrow forest road. Diesel fumes hang low among snow-draped pines. Inside one turret, a young corporal from Kansas grinds gloved hands together before loosening a wrench from the side panel. He's 22 and has spent half his life fixing tractors on his family's farm. To his right, a patch of white vapor rises as another Sherman coughs into life. Engines howling under the weight of war. Across the lines, German officers huddle around a frayed map. One chuckles, muttering that American tank units fight like farmers with toys. The others grin, confident in their thicker steel, their tigers, their panthers. But within hours, that laughter will be buried beneath the roar of engines and the crack of ruptured snow. The farmboys, they mocked, are about to unleash General George S Patton's fury, a rolling storm of armor that will thunder all the way to their city walls. By the final months of 1944, Europe was defined by exhaustion. The vast front, stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border, had become a chessboard of attrition. The Allies had broken out of Normandy 6 months earlier, racing across France with astonishing speed. Paris had been liberated in August. Antwerp was open by winter. But that speed came with a price. Long supply lines, worn tanks, and men who had not rested since the hedgerow fighting of summer. The German High Command understood this fatigue. Behind their lines, officers spoke of one last chance, an opportunity to reverse the unstoppable tide of Allied armor. It would strike through the Ardennes, the very forest Hitler had used in 1940. The plan, they believed, could split the Western armies in two and perhaps force negotiations. To fuel their confidence, intelligence officers repeated a comforting myth, that the American tank was inferior and its crews, largely mechanical amateurs, relied on farmyard ingenuity instead of professional training. There was some fragment of truth to this. A significant number of American tankers came from the Midwest and rural South, men who knew machinery better than textbooks. They could patch a cracked fuel line with chewing gum foil or restart a frozen engine using poured-in gasoline vapors. But those same skills would soon turn Patton's Third Army into one of the most flexible and self-reliant armored forces in the world. Patton himself was a general unlike any other. He dressed like a warrior from another century. Ivory-handled pistols, polished boots, a studied sense of theatrical command. But his methods were born of hard calculus. Where the Germans sought the perfect kill with finely honed machinery, Patton prized speed, improvisation, and willpower. He trained his men to move faster, think faster, and use the terrain as their ally. To him, the tank was only as strong as the man who dared to push it hardest. By early December, Patton's Third Army was expected to hold defensive positions near Metz, preparing for winter. The front seemed quiet. Yet, deep within Germany's forests, armored divisions gathered silently under the Ardennes canopy. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the counteroffensive that would later be called the Battle of the Bulge, was about to begin when the first shells landed on the thin American lines of the 106th Infantry Division on December 16th. Chaos rippled through the Allied front. Columns of panzers punched westward under the cover of mist. The Germans sought to pierce through to the Meuse River before the Allies could regroup. For days, confusion reigned. Fuel dumps were seized, villages overrun, and in headquarters rooms from Paris to Liège, officers debated one question. If the Germans had thrown all their might into the Ardennes, who could stop them? The answer came on December 18th, when Patton, in a conference with Eisenhower at Verdun, stated with absolute certainty that he could pivot an entire army north within 48 hours. His staff had already prepared contingency plans in secret. Maps had been redrawn days earlier on his intuition alone. As the snow thickened and enemy tanks pressed westward, Patton's farmboys began to stir, ordered to perform a maneuver that analysts deemed impossible. A 90-degree turn of 3 full corps in midwinter, through ice-clogged roads and endless convoys of supplies. The very traits that the Germans mocked: flexible thinking, mechanical skill, rough field adaptation, would now define the counterstroke that saved the Western Front. The roar of that transformation would soon echo through Bastogne, across the Ardennes, and into every German report that once dismissed the Americans as clumsy amateurs. The war's balance was about to hinge not on superior armor, but on the determination inside those thin-skinned Shermans. When Allied soldiers first encountered the formidable German Tiger and Panther tanks in Normandy, the difference was shocking. The Tiger's 88mm gun could pierce a Sherman's frontal armor long before the American's 75mm shell could return the favor. The Panther's sloped armor, speed, and firepower seemed to embody the precision of industrial warfare. Reports from the front reached Berlin describing how American tanks routinely erupted into flames after a single hit. It was comforting propaganda. Proof, they claimed, that discipline and engineering still favored the Reich. But behind those grand boasts lay an uncomfortable truth. By late 1944, German industry was collapsing. Fuel was scarce, factories were being bombed daily, and replacement parts were a logistical nightmare. Each Tiger that rolled onto the battlefield required meticulous maintenance, often breaking down after only 50 miles of travel. Meanwhile, American factories across Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland had perfected the rhythm of mass production. Hundreds of Shermans leaving assembly lines each week. The German officer corps often sneered at this approach as industrial brute force, they considered. The Sherman a tin coffin, cheaply made for a numerically superior army that compensated with brute numbers. Yet, when analyzed objectively, the American design philosophy represented something entirely different. Mobility over might, reliability over elegance. A Sherman could be repaired in hours rather than days, its interchangeable parts replaced in the field, often by the soldiers themselves. Here lay the real core of Patton's doctrine. He cared less for individual tank performance than for the synchrony of movement. Armor, infantry, artillery, and logistics acting as a single living organism. He once lectured that fixed fortifications are monuments to the stupidity of man. His war moved with the same relentlessness as his philosophy. Never stop, never dig in, never let the enemy dictate the pace. While German divisions in the Ardennes stockpiled fuel in captured drums and prayed for overcast skies to ground American bombers, Patton drilled his headquarters staff on contingency maneuvers. Intelligence intercepts hinted at German reinforcements building in the east, but few in Chaff truly believed they could mount a coordinated winter offensive. The Allies' air dominance appeared overwhelming, their front stable. That illusion would shatter under the weight of Hitler's ambition. At dawn on December 16th, over 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks struck the quiet sector of the Ardennes. After months of stalemate, the thunder of artillery rolled through the forest like the voice of a returning storm. Columns of panzers, some Tigers, many Panthers, others aging Mark IVs, charged westward under the fog's concealment. The offensive achieved surprise. American units were overrun, communication lines severed, and Bastogne, the crucial crossroads town, was soon encircled. News of the attack reached Patton as he dined with his staff near Metz. The mood in the room didn't change. He had warned his officers something like this was coming. Now, the hypothesis became reality. Within an hour, he ordered his intelligence officers to bring map overlays. Within 12, his entire staff was reconfiguring supply routes northward through frozen roads. At the same time, German commanders in the field wrote confident entries in their war diaries describing uncoordinated American resistance and disorganized retreat. They did not yet realize that within 3 days, those same uncoordinated tankers would pivot faster than any army in history. In the villages of Lorraine and along the Moselle, tank crews cleaned barrels, marked routes, and loaded spare tracks onto hulls. Each Sherman would soon prove a cog in a thunderous machine, a living demonstration of what speed, adaptability, and audacity could achieve when discipline met imagination. In Patton's headquarters, a single sentence defined the coming operation: relieve Bastogne. The moment the order left his lips, one of the greatest logistical pivots in modern warfare began. What had started as a German gamble was about to awaken the most dangerous thing in any war: an underestimated enemy with momentum. The image of the American tank crew at the end of 1944 was not one of textbook precision or aristocratic bearing. These were men drawn from garages, wheat fields, and small-town workshops, boys who had learned patience through the stubbornness of old engines and storm-twisted tools. They carried the smell of oil more comfortably than the polish of a parade ground boot. When orders arrived to swing north through winter terrain, they didn't debate doctrine. They simply began refueling, checking tracks, tightening bolts, and calculating how long it would take before the road froze over. The German caricature of these men as farm boys was not born of cruelty, but of ignorance. Within the Wehrmacht, tank service was a technical elite. The Panzertruppen trained for years in specialized schools. They studied map tactics, engine calibration, radio protocol. An American tanker, by contrast, could have learned to drive his Sherman in a matter of weeks. Yet, what the Germans misunderstood was how those weeks sat atop a lifetime of improvisation. A young man who had coaxed broken machinery back to life on a Dakota plain knew something about problem-solving under pressure. In this war, adaptability would defeat purity. When Patton's orders reached the battalions, crews began marking their tanks with chalk: routes, numbers, reminders. The Shermans needed maintenance for the rapid move north, yet few complained. They understood that the German advance was gaining ground by the hour. In their turrets, the air was sharp with metal and breath. Radios crackled with call signs as weather reports declared another snowfront approaching. Men tied scarves around faces, muttering prayers beneath engine din. To the average crewman, Patton himself was less a general than a force of myth. He drove his men hard, cursed without mercy, demanded obedience so absolute it bordered on fanaticism. But his troops respected him in an instinctive way. He gave them clear orders and an unshakable confidence that every hardship had purpose. When he spoke of turning an army 90 degrees, there was no disbelief. It simply meant the impossible was now scheduled. Technically, the move demanded discipline at levels unseen in previous campaigns. Third Army's 3 corps, Tourtine, Ventiect, and Thirty, had to cross hundreds of miles in convoys through snow, ice, and darkness. Tanks that stalled were pulled aside and stripped for parts on the roadside. Truck drivers followed marker lights through whiteout conditions. In these moments, the farm boy spirit became the backbone of survival. They used wood fires under engines to thaw frozen oil. They fashioned new battery cables from spare wire. When tracked vehicles slipped off icy roads, entire crews jumped out to dig, lift, and haul with the same tenacity once spent plowing fields. Throughout it all, Patton's tactical philosophy guided every choice: keep moving. The German offensive relied on seizing time and space faster than the Allies could react. Patton intended to crush that assumption. His army would not just meet the enemy, it would arrive before logic allowed. Patton understood the psychology of command better than most generals of his era. He believed soldiers needed visible leadership, a presence both inspiring and intimidating. Touring his columns at the head of a jeep, Wearing his polished helmet and ivory-handled pistols, he embodied momentum itself. Where other commanders saw bad weather as an obstacle, Patton treated the storm as cover. His words to his staff were clipped and cold. "Let the bastards freeze. We'll move faster." This attitude echoed through every level of his army. Staff officers simplified communication to ensure decisions could be made from the field upward. Maps were drawn directly on vehicle hoods. Routes were not argued but executed. The chain of command behaved less like bureaucracy and more like instinct. By contrast, late-war German coordination was fragmenting. Units operated on delayed orders. Supply convoys were shattered from Allied air raids, radios unreliable or already intercepted. What united Patton's formations was relentless adaptability. Against armored thrusts that relied on heavy frontal engagement, he emphasized flanking speed. His Shermans moved in hunter packs, supported by artillery and roving tactical air squadrons. When one tank was lost, the others advanced. They treated risk as routine because Patton's war doctrine no longer sought perfect victories. It sought continuous forward motion. On the morning of December 20th, when reconnaissance pilots reported worsening snow near Bastogne, Patton smiled. The sky that grounded Allied aircraft also grounded the Luftwaffe. His men's greatest threats would be terrain and exhaustion, not bombs. The tanks rolled into the storm regardless. What the German officers had mocked as reckless cowboy tactics had become the spearhead of strategy. It was in this crucible of ice and urgency that the Third Army's transformation into a legendary force occurred. The American method, practical, unspectacular, but ceaseless, was now proving to be as lethal as any doctrinal perfection. Germany had once possessed. The next phase would show just how deeply that underestimation would cost the Reich. Beneath the thunder of tanks and the bravado of frontline engagements lay another war, quiet, logistical, and decisive. It was fought across convoys, depots, and engineer yards by grease-stained hands and cold fingers threading cables. While German tank battalions struggled to repair breakdowns with dwindling fuel and tools, the Americans had transformed their logistics chain into an industrial organism that stretched from the ports of Cherbourg to the forests of Luxembourg. Everything formed Piho. Move of Patton's armored columns was fed by that system. Replacement tanks brought by overnight rail. Fuel trucks carefully routed under camouflage nets. Mechanics trained to replace transmissions by lantern light. The U.S. maintenance mentality treated modern warfare like an assembly line that refused to stop. The German army, once the epitome of precision, now suffered the weight of its own complexity. Field reports told of Panthers bogged down because of frozen oil, Tigers abandoned after drivetrain failures. Spare parts for their specialized engines arrived days late, or not at all. Crews who had once laughed at the Americans' cheap tanks now scrounged parts from destroyed vehicles just to keep one operational. Sherman crews, meanwhile, carried spare road wheels, track links, and welded armor plates wherever space allowed. They had developed a grim humor about it. One extra track link on the hull was both decoration and survival. This ethos, the willingness to rebuild under fire, turned small American maintenance teams into miracle workers. A tank knocked out at dusk could be back in action by morning, its crew moving on instinct, guided by the flashlight glow within its open engine bay. The advantage compounded over time. Every repaired Sherman rejoined its column. Every immobilized Panther remained an obstacle to its own retreat. Logistics had become the real battlefield, and Patton commanded it like a general of industry as much as a soldier of war. The enemy's mirror and the erosion of certainty. Inside command bunkers between Bastogne and Hufvliet, German staff officers tracked reports with growing disbelief. Their early victories, sharp and dazzling, had given way to friction. Columns jammed on narrow Ardennes roads. fuel convoys ambushed or lost in snowstorms. American radio intercepts began to predict and counter their moves with uncanny speed. How could this supposed amateur army coordinate so precisely in these conditions? Captured documents later revealed the answer. Decentralized efficiency. Patton's troops used radio not as hierarchy, but as conversation. Tank commanders, artillery observers, and armored infantry all shared frequencies. The result was a symphony of improvisation that the rigid Wehrmacht command structure could not imitate. Orders came down, but initiative rose upward. Every lieutenant thought like a general because the situation demanded it. German intelligence reports, once saturated with scorn, shifted in tone. By late December, the language hardened into caution. One field note from the 5th Panzer Army warned, "Enemy armor displays unpredictable reaction. Their movement defies expected rhythm." In field terms, this meant fear. The experience of facing Patton's Third Army reshaped the German perception of Allied warfare. They had assumed material abundance could not translate into combat ingenuity. They were wrong. American radios, logistics, and improvisation blurred the boundary between machines and men into one continuous force. Yet it wasn't merely mechanical superiority that shook their confidence. It was emotional endurance. Those frost-bitten, fuel-stained crews refused to rest. For every village retaken, they offered little celebration, just refueling, new coordinates, a shared cigarette, and a turn of the treads toward the next ridge. The Germans had trained to outthink their opponents. Now they found themselves outlasted. Within days, rumors reached the front that Patton's army was approaching Bastogne faster than any German planner believed feasible. Staff officers who had mocked farmer courage now ordered desperate ambushes to slow the approach. The same precision they once celebrated became their prison. Their rigid plans could not adjust to an enemy that refused to behave predictably. By the turn of the year, the great paradox of the Ardennes offensive had been laid bare. The Wehrmacht's sophistication had met the Americans' adaptability, and adaptability was winning. Each German engine failure, each moment of indecision was drowned beneath that recurring, echoing sound. The low, rolling growl of Shermans advancing on frozen roads. And in its rhythm, Europe began to hear defeat arriving not through brilliance, but through endless momentum. The armies now stood on the brink. The decisive confrontation, the meeting of Pattons, relief columns, and the desperate German counterthrust around Bastogne would decide whether the war in the West turned to chaos or to salvation. The next chapter would reveal how that collision unfolded, when speed, courage, and command met at their highest pitch. December 22, 1944, the sky above northeastern France pressed down like lead. Snow fell in dense, wind-driven sheets, coating the roads and muffling the sound of engines. That strange stillness that falls before a storm consumes everything. Along a jagged line stretching 50 miles, Patton's Third Army moved north. Convoys crawled through the storm. Shermans pulled half-tracks, jeeps dragged fuel wagons, supply trucks wove behind snowplows operating under blackout conditions. Every mile was won by human persistence. Crews chipped ice from treads with entrenching tools so their tanks wouldn't seize. Engineers cut detours through frozen fields when bridges collapsed under weight. Some German officers, huddled in forward command posts, dismissed the movement as rumor. Others thought it impossible. Patton's army, they reasoned, had been positioned for static defense near Metz. To shift that force 90 degrees in winter was unthinkable. Yet, by the time their reports reached higher command, armored spearheads were already approaching the outskirts of Bastogne. Inside Bastogne, surrounded American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne were holding grimly against constant shelling. Their supplies were nearly gone. Medical tents were full, the wounded lying on stretchers buried under blankets. Snow drifted in through holes in roofs. Still, they held. The garrison's single radio kept repeating a coded promise: relief en route. That relief was Patton's Third Army, his armor moving through snow that rose past wheel hubs, the temperature dropping to 10 degrees below freezing. In one night alone, the 4th Armored Division advanced 20 miles under total darkness. Drivers navigated only by compass and the glow from the tank ahead. No headlights, no rest. A major in the 37th Tank Battalion later recalled looking out over an endless file of armor stretching down a forested slope, each vehicle a ghost of steam in the white haze. "It looked like the whole world moved north," he said. German patrols began reporting contact on roads they'd thought safe. Machine gun fire flickered in the storm, tracer rounds vanishing into fog. Word filtered through the German lines: "The Americans are coming from the south." It sounded like panic, but it was simple fact. Patton's calculated gamble. Patton's command post was a storm of motion. Maps pinned, telephones bursting to life, muffled transmissions merging into constant static. He knew his advance risked everything. If his columns were cut off or starved of fuel, the relief of Bastogne would collapse. Yet he believed speed itself could be his shield. If he moved fast enough, the Germans wouldn't recalibrate in time. On December 23rd, skies began to clear. Allied air groups, grounded for a week, roared into the open blue at dawn. C-47s dropped supplies over Bastogne, ammunition, food, medical crates drifting down on parachutes like falling hope. Fighter bombers swept down roads, strafing German armor trapped in narrow valleys. The rhythm of war shifted in a single sunrise. The German advance, once sharp and confident, began to freeze both literally and figuratively. Fuel ran out, tires locked in ice, crews fought sleepless. The roaring counteroffensive had turned to a crawl just as Patton's armor crested the southern ridge. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, the 4th Armored Division struck the German outer defenses near Chaumont, just south of Bastogne. The first major engagement hit like a hammer blow of metal and snow. Shermans advanced in column, gunners scanning for concealed panthers. Muzzle flashes erupted from tree lines. The white forest burned orange under the barrage. Several Shermans erupted in flames, but the rest ground forward until artillery joined in, saturating the hill slopes. By Christmas night, radio intercepts confirmed heavy fighting within miles of the surrounded city. German officers argued over whether they faced an entire new army group. They could not believe such a force had been redeployed so fast. Patton watched the reports pile up, his jaw set as his operations chief read out each breakthrough. When told one column might reach the city perimeter by morning, he replied only, "They damned well will." In those few days, the miracle had shape. 250,000 men, 400 tanks, and 100 guns pivoted through winter chaos. It was the fastest large-scale maneuver on record, executed in weather that even nature seemed to forbid. What began as laughter in enemy mess halls had become disbelief bordering on fear. At the front, tank crews no longer thought about the mockery that had once trailed them. Their world was reduced to noise, recoil, shattered glass, and radio man's voices echoing through static. Their mission was singular: get to Bastogne. The final miles would decide the survival of an entire front and define Patton's legend forever. December 26, 1944. The storm had eased but left a gray world of slush and ruin. Patton's spearhead, the 37th Tank Battalion led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, pushed through the mist toward the town of Assenois, the last German-held village blocking the road into Bastogne. The air smelled of cordite and diesel. Wrecked half-tracks littered the ditches like frozen carcasses. Every field was a sheet of ice gouged by tracks. Abrams's column crept forward under constant fire from 88mm guns hidden behind barns. Machine gun tracers snapped past at hip height. Several Shermans took hits, steel shrieking, Yet the battalion pressed on. Infantry rode the rear engine decks, leaping off at every stop to clear obstacles. Ahead loomed the narrow road that led directly to Bastogna's southern perimeter. Every man knew that down that road waited an encircled division counting the moments between survival and surrender. At 1650 hours, the lead tank, Cobra King, burst through the final German roadblock. Dust, ice, and smoke erupted around it as its gunner fired point-blank at an enemy half-track blocking the lane. The path to Bastogne opened in a violent heartbeat. Behind them, entire companies followed, their treads carving the snow into black trenches. As night fell, Sherman's silhouettes rose over the ridgeline south of Bastogne. Paratroopers of the 101st saw the shapes first, distant, flickering through the haze. At first they braced for another German assault. Then they noticed the stars and bars marking glinting in the firelight. One young sergeant dropped his rifle and simply shouted, "They're ours!" The two forces met in the snow, tankers emerging from hatches, paratroopers limping forward through rubble. Men embraced, shouting over the din of ongoing artillery. A few wept openly. After 7 days surrounded, with ammunition nearly gone and winter closing in, Bastogne was relieved. Patton's gamble had succeeded. The German command reeled. Reports from the field were contradictory. Some units insisted Bastogne remained fully encircled. Others claimed Patton's armor had already broken through. Communications were collapsing. Entire formations found themselves isolated by advancing American armor. Where once they had judged the U.S. tankers predictable, now those same tank units struck from unexpected directions, faster than intelligence could track. Patton ordered the offensive to continue. No pause, no rest. He intended not only to relieve Bastogne, but to shatter the German spearhead entirely. U.S. artillery massed along the roads south of the city, turning night into a flickering storm of light. Each round landed among retreating columns trying desperately to withdraw eastward. Tank after tank burned in the valleys, their silhouettes outlined against the glare. Turbulent iron against a frozen horizon. German diaries from that period show a change in tone. The arrogance of December 16th gave way to weary disbelief. One lieutenant wrote on December 27th, "The enemy advances in snowstorms. His armor never stops. We hear the rumble all night, like an endless train." The thunder that rolled through the Ardennes was no longer metaphorical. It was the sound of Patton's army reclaiming momentum for the Allies. Behind the lines, supply trucks moved at reckless pace, bringing fuel, ammunition, and cigarettes. Engineers repaired bridges overnight, replacing wooden spans with steel girders dragged from depots. Within a week, Patton's Third Army had transformed the region into a moving fortress. Every road seemed to generate columns of Shermans, mud-splattered, engines coughing, guns blackened from fire. The Germans, once the masters of armored warfare, now faced its perfected student. Their tanks might have been heavier, their guns longer, their armor thicker, but the battlefield belonged to the force that could move, adapt, and endure. By New Year's Eve, Hitler's great winter gamble had collapsed into chaos. The farmboys with toys had carried the day, proving that tenacity and adaptability outweighed even the best engineering. Patton's own reflections that week were terse but fierce. "This is war simplified," he told a correspondent. "They started it. We'll finish it in motion." For the German officers who had mocked those farmboy tricks, the lesson had come. Thundering to their city walls, each tank and each determined crew another. Note in the closing score of the Reich's ambitions in the West. Snow continued to fall, but now every road echoed with the sound that symbolized defeat, the relentless grind of American treads pressing eastward. The sky cleared above Bastogne on the dawn of December 28th, and from Patton's command, staff came a final phrasing of success. Mission accomplished. Bastogne relieved. The The sound of that message traveled faster than the tanks themselves. Within days, the front would stabilize again, the Bulge retreating eastward like a frozen tide. Yet its imprint on every soldier who had fought there, the memory of that movement, that sound, would remain. The war in the West would never again favor the Germans, and in the reverberation of that victory lay both triumph and reckoning. By the first week of January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was effectively over. What had begun as Hitler's last gamble now stood revealed as a catastrophe. The once feared German armored divisions were shattered, their tanks gutted on roadsides, their men trudging through snow toward a homeland already burning under Allied bombs. The weather that had once cloaked their surprise now turned against them, freezing oil, immobilizing engines, killing the wounded. Patton's Third Army had not only relieved Bastogne, it had transformed a rescue operation into a relentless counterassault. His corps regrouped in a torrent of motion, clearing one village after another, reclaiming choke points, hunting remnants of the shattered 5th Panzer Army through the forests. The same farmboys, mocked by their enemies, now became the relentless engine of pursuit. For the first time in years, German morale visibly fractured. Interrogated prisoners spoke with stunned respect for American coordination. How radio net efficiency allowed artillery to land within minutes of spotting, how tank columns struck in converging arcs, and how Patton's men seemed immune to exhaustion. What they had mistaken for naivety was now understood as a different breed of mastery, improvisational warfare fueled by belief in momentum itself. The numbers spoke their own story. German forces lost nearly 600 tanks and assault guns, over 1,000 aircraft grounded or destroyed, and more than 80,000 casualties. The U.S. Third Army suffered too. Men frozen at their posts, burned inside tanks, lost under collapsing villages. But the line held, and the push never stopped. Journalists arriving after the battle described fields littered with hulks, panthers half buried in snow beside burning Shermans, black smoke twisting skyward through silence. Army photographers captured tread marks etched deep into ice, symbols of a new kind of warfare where endurance outweighed perfection. Patton's leadership entered legend in those weeks. His command post, always nearest the sound of guns, became synonymous with energy and defiance. He had proven that an army could pivot on intuition and sustain itself on belief, a feat that seemed equal parts planning and spirit. His prayer for clear weather, famously written and distributed to hundreds of chaplains during the worst of the snowstorms, became a strange emblem of his realism, praying not for victory, but for the ability to fight. 3 days later, the skies cleared. In letters home, tankers wrote not of heroism, but of machines that wouldn't stop moving, of friends left by the roadside, of engines that coughed like dying animals before roaring back to life. Those human testimonies carried the real measure of victory, the will to keep advancing even when logic dictated halting. The German High Command could no longer hide the truth. The failed Ardennes offensive had exhausted all that remained of its strategic reserve. The last trained tank crews were gone. The last batch of elite armored divisions either destroyed or skeletal. From that winter onward, the Reich would fight only in retreat. And for the Allied forces massing on the western frontier, the path into Germany now lay open. The thunder of that winter did not fade. It simply rolled east. After Bastogne's relief, the Western Front settled into a grim rhythm of pursuit. What had begun as one of history's largest and most audacious counteroffensives ended with the German army clawing back toward the Rhine, its morale spent, its supply columns shattered. In January, intelligence intercepts told the story starkly. Orders delayed by days, units reduced to company strength, fuel measured in cups rather than barrels. Patton, unwilling to waste momentum, continued pressing north and east. Town names marked on his maps were crossed out within hours, as fresh coordinates replaced them. Before the end of February, his tanks were again moving toward Trier and the Saar Basin. Allied High Command once more faced the familiar problem of keeping up with him. Eisenhower wryly remarked, "Patton's army doesn't rest. It just refuels." Everywhere his armor rolled, it left evidence of the transformation that had taken place that winter. American tank warfare had matured not by perfecting the machine, but by mastering the system around it. When a Sherman threw a track, spare links arrived within hours. Damaged engines were swapped overnight. Mechanics were no longer rear echelon workers. They were lifelines attached to every column. The logistical miracle that had carried Third Army north to Bastogne now carried it all, the way into Germany. As for the German officers who had once mocked farmer tactics, many would later find themselves sitting across interrogation tables, confronted by descriptions of the same battle they believed unwinnable. Their remarks, preserved in Allied records, are strikingly similar, praising American coordination, fire discipline, and mobility. One panzer major reportedly admitted, "We never understood how they repaired so many tanks so quickly. Ours were perfect. Theirs just never stopped." For Allied troops, the cost remained carved deep. Hundreds lay buried in shallow graves marked by helmet crosses. The Ardennes ceased to be a battle. It became a memory of sheer endurance. Bastogne itself, its church towers rebuilt from shattered stone, became a symbol of resilience, printed on post-war posters and U.S. Army manuals alike. The success also redefined global military doctrine. After the war, analysts traced Patton's methods forward. The emphasis on speed, inter-unit communication, and battlefield self-sufficiency. In time, these principles would become cornerstones of modern mechanized warfare. The lesson was clear. Machines alone did not win battles. Systems did, driven by human willpower, ingenuity, and trust. When Patton's tanks finally crossed the Rhine in March 1945, many of the crews who had driven through that winter were still with him, scarred, weathered, but intact. They had watched the Reich's fortresses collapse ahead of them. They had seen disbelief turn to surrender. What echoed behind them was not the sound of triumphal fanfare, but the low drums of continuing engines, carrying them ever deeper into the heart of an enemy now broken. The war in Europe had only months left. Its end was inevitable, but its memory was already being written. In lead, in steel, and in the echoes of Cobra King crashing through the outer defenses of a besieged town against every expectation. Those farm boys with tricks had won the last great tank duel of the Western Front, proving that flexibility could outfight arrogance, and that motion itself could become a weapon. Beyond the smoke and snow, history shifted on its axle. In the stillness that followed the Ardennes campaign, Europe seemed to hold its breath. Snow melted into mud. Fields once scarred by tracks and craters returned to silence. Villagers emerged from cellars to find roads lined with burnt armor, blackened silhouettes of machines that, only weeks earlier, had shaken the ground. Patton's triumph at Bastogne was more than a tactical victory. It was a revelation about what truly sustains an army. The Germans had built their legend on precision and engineering perfection. The Americans had answered with practicality and endurance, proof that innovation does not reside only in factories, but in the minds of men willing to adapt. Every Sherman that rolled northward through that frozen storm told the same story, that courage and ingenuity could compensate for every inch of thinner armor or lighter gun. Those farm boys who welded spare track for extra protection, who learned to repair engines in the dark, had forged a new vision of modern warfare, one grounded in humility, flexibility, and collective will. History often remembers the great winter battles for their suffering, yet beneath that suffering lay transformation. The Battle of the Bulge ended the illusion of German invincibility and vindicated the raw, Experimental spirit of American arms. Patton's army, born of motion and belief, demonstrated that discipline could coexist with spontaneity, that order might thrive amid improvisation. His tanks did not merely reach Bastogne. They announced a truth that would echo through every conflict since, that the measure of strength lies not in superiority of metal, but in the soul behind it. When the engines finally stopped and silence reclaimed the Ardennes, the frost carried a memory deeper than victory. Somewhere in that quiet, one could almost still hear it, the fading thunder of Patton's armor, rolling not just toward Bastogne, but into legend itself.